my name is Jared. I'm the co-founder of Status. We aim to be a fully decentralized hybrid between like a secure peer-to-peer instant messenger and a DApp browser for targeting Android and iOS. The main differentiator is we're actually running an Ethereum node directly on the device. Yeah, so that's a good point. So basically, you can think of for identities, like already in the blockchain, you already have one, and that's still your address or your public key. But there are some issues with that, whether you're talking about the ephemerality of keys or if you want to get rid of them, and perhaps you want to create some kind of smart contract that's on chain. We implement ERC 725, which is what's becoming the standard open identity smart contract. And the idea is behind that is then your keys can be somewhat disposable, and you can have like recovery mechanisms on chain with your identity. People can also make attestations on your identity, whether that's like a government passport or making KYC. Whether they're needed or not is a different question. But that's like a huge proponent, is like you actually can prove who you are on chain. And maybe develop a reputation around it later on. So as far as the instant messenger is concerned, like the base layer is definitely communication. And whenever you're talking about communication, you're talking about the meeting of minds. So there has to be two parties that are involved. And for that to even work, they have to be identifiable in some sense. Even if it's not directly tied to an identity, it can be tied to their language, for example. Now, of course, on top of that, we build this identity smart contract structure, which allows you to get some more assurances in terms of like key recovery and this disposable keys and giving yourself like usernames and that sort of thing. And that can certainly move into the mainstream or wider area in terms of like governments are taking up this technology. You can imagine a government's actually providing attestations that you are a passport holder of a certain jurisdiction, or you're a citizen of that jurisdiction, or you are of a certain age, or you have a driver's license, or anything like this. You know, so it's very fundamentally compatible, and there's a lot of identity projects out there that are working on that sort of thing. We're attacking it from the blockchain smart contract side first. So, for example, with Status, you may lose your phone, and you haven't backed up your key phrase because you've been a naughty boy, and just not followed best practices. In this case, it's not a big deal because if you have this recovery mechanism attached to your identity, you may be able to find different ways of recovering that. In our case, we've generalized the way that you do key recovery, so you can do social recovery without letting it known to the people who have the power to be able to help you recover your account. So similar to like Facebook or VK, where you can actually ask like 3 or 5 friends to help you recover your account. Or you could do things like keep some kind of recovery mechanism in a safety deposit box or under your bed. So that way, if you lose your phone or you lose your private keys for whatever reason, it's not a big deal. You can just recover your assets, which are in your identity, and continue on chain as you were with a new private key. There's plenty of different identity projects. I think as far as Ethereum is related, the other larger player is Uport, and they have an amazing application, and they're working on a very similar identity structure. We don't have one ourselves. We've just implemented one of the ERC 725, which is essentially the Ethereum improvement specification for this particular subject. And it's pretty well thought out. The only thing that I would change is having the current way that attestations are done is that you have to essentially create some attestation on chain, but there may be some data that you don't want to hash of directly, and you don't want to have the data on chain directly either. So in this case, what would be great is to create like a Merkle root hash on chain and a data structure underneath it, which contains all of your private information that you can then use to verify off chain. And so you get a little more privacy that way. For me, like I'm a proponent of public blockchains, and like I'm much more of a crypto anarchist, so I wouldn't be so inclined to do KYC. However, if we want blockchains to kind of move into sort of mainstream adoption, we have to deal with regulation and with some of the rules around that. And so KYC would be one of the attestations or features on your identity to prove that you are accredited investor, for example.
I think, so as far as like going to a bank or some other institution that requires some information from you, regardless of how you do it, I mean, as soon as you make that one-time trust decision to give that information up, you have given that information up, period, right? So you have to be very careful about this, and I would probably suggest looking into zero-knowledge proofs as a way of proving certain things about you without any divulging any information, particularly ZK Starks, very interesting field of research.
The idea that a human can have multiple identities is something that sits well with me. The issue with having multiple identities is perhaps that you are unknown on chain or to other actors on there in terms of in a trust relationship. That doesn't mean all transactions need to have some trust component to it. I'm the proponent of doing things in a trustless manner. So the idea of creating identity or multiple identities and then creating more of a history or reputation around an individual identity is going to give you a lot more leverage in terms of like more complex financial transactions you can do and other ways you can interact with other people to show that you are not a bad actor, let's say, in the network. I think it's just the idea of creating the solutions for that is to create like an identity on that, and then hopefully we create a reputation system in the future that's civil resistant. That's probably, I haven't seen one that works that way yet. But if you had that, like you could imagine over a period of time that this particular identity, even though you're not strongly bound to it, you are wanting to use that more because other people are going to trust that more and want to, and there may be some smart contracts out there that actually mandate a certain level of trust and a certain level of history. Say, for example, like if you're voting if you're voting at age 18, then you've got this whole history of transactions and this whole identity and reputation you built up that proves that you're actually a real candidate or a real participant in the process. I think the idea is that if a criminal is going to create a new identity, let's say, and then try to act in the network, that identity isn't going to have much history behind it. It's not going to have much trust involved in or attestations from other counterparties. And in this case, they will have to spend a lot of money or put a lot of cost into actually generating an identity that would be considered valid by other smart contracts and by other people. But that doesn't mean that they're excluded from taking transactions, for example. There might be other criminals who are willing to work in a more trustless setup, but that's because there's escrows and insurance and some on-chain intermediation involved. And it also depends on what you mean by criminal as well, right? So like any trustless dApps that don't really require hard identity and you can be pseudo-anonymous or even in some cases fully anonymous, I think is amazing for free speech and creative expression. And it's something that humanity hasn't really had the chance to really use as a tool, and it's something that I think is incredibly valuable. And it certainly has its place.
I mean, in terms of whether you want an identity or not, I think we make that choice. It's more the sort of applications that you want to use. So for example, in Web 2.0, whenever you want to use a service, you have to like register and fill out a captcha in your email. That's to give away your firstborn child or something like that just to use this service. And I think that's going to happen again, but in a very different way. Like you will have your identity, but there'll be no login because you just automatically use that identity in the browser, for example. So yeah, I think that's the services that you use determine what kind of identity you need and how much information you need to give